one is a pretty solid date. And then the northern kingdom lasts, as we already saw, till 722. The southern kingdom lasts until 586 with the Babylonians. And then you have the Babylonian captivity in here, and then the Hebrews allowed to return around 539 and following. So, what we are looking at when we talk about the problem of the 10th century is this right here. Basically, David-Solomon time. From the biblical point of view, David and Solomon are kind of a big deal, aren't they? Right? They're important kings. They are players on the Middle Eastern stage. Now, we've got to be a little bit careful of the telephoto effect. You ever do photography, use a telephoto lens? The funny thing about a telephoto lens can be really good if you want to take a picture of something far away. But the thing with a telephoto lens is you can't see very much at a time. So you have a very small something that completely controls your field of view. The Bible primarily operates with a telephoto lens. Okay, so you're looking at Israel like this. And over here you got the Assyrian Empire and the Persian Empire and all these big, I got my telephoto lens, I'm not paying attention to that. And every once in a while they pop in and say hello, but otherwise, because of that, the danger with a telephoto lens is it makes things appear bigger than they are. Huh? Right? So David, Solomon, they look really big in this telephoto lens, but viewed in light of the Assyrian Empire, well, it's not quite there yet, but you get the idea. Viewed in light of the greater stuff that we were already talking about, Israel's pretty small bananas. So, the Bible, though, talks about David and Solomon as true rulers of a substantial kingdom with a lot of power to do a lot of stuff. That much it says for sure, doesn't it? And the question is, how does that fit with archaeology? Do we have evidence from the 10th century BC that suggests that we have a powerful monarchy at work? This is a matter of resource control, right? How much resources can these guys control? And how would you test that archaeologically? So we enter the problem of the 10th century. Now, the traditional view was articulated by a guy named Albright. He started, there's a school in Jerusalem that still bears his name, the Albright School of Biblical Archaeology. And Albright said this: the key test, and by the way, this is true in Hawaii as well, the key test of the power of a monarchy is whether that person has the capacity to create monumental architecture. Monumental architecture. What does that mean? It means big stuff. Building big things. When you think of it, building big things, what does it require? It requires a lot of resources, and it requires that somebody have not only be able to provide the resources, but that somebody has to be able to coordinate all the people and focus their attentions on one big project. I told you about Hawaii. So I don't know if you pay any attention, but you are right here in the middle of monumental architecture country for the ancient Hawaiian monarchy. So if you go up the coast and you go to Pu'ukohola, Heiau, overlooking Kauai up there, that is monumental architecture. If you go out here to the Luau grounds where Island Breeze does their thing, and you look out there, sticking out into the water, and you see that grass hut sitting on a knoll with the white tower next to it, that is a Hawaiian heiau. That is monumental architecture. There are these sites all over the place right along this coast. That hotel that they just closed down in Keauhou, that has actually 5 monumental heiau on the site. You might have seen 2 of them. You can go out by the tennis courts and you can see the reconstruction of those out there. I'm actually writing a book on that, the monumental architecture in this area, Hawaii. That's why I paid a lot of attention to it. And this is evidence that the kings of this area had quite a lot of resources and the ability to coordinate those resources to build these big temple sites all along this coast. Okay? So that is evidence of a powerful monarchy, which, by the way, was almost unknown in Polynesia. The Hawaiians actually were able to do that kind of stuff earlier and more significantly than a lot of much older Polynesian societies as they moved across the islands coming in this direction. So it's one of the things that makes the Hawaiians sort of stand apart as pretty special people pre-contact. Well, Albright says, okay, what is the first evidence we have of Hebrews engaging in monumental architecture that would say that has to be the king who has the capacity to do that kind of stuff, right? So now you have a powerful monarchy, and you have evidence of it on the ground that you can find in archaeology because you can find the big stuff they built. And Albright says you can find it with David, and in particular with Solomon. David built a palace, but in particular Solomon, he built a number of big things. And those big things demonstrate he was a big king who had a lot of resources and the ability to coordinate them, as in fact the biblical text says he did. If you cannot find that kind of thing on the ground during Solomon's time, it means the Bible is cheating, right? It is attributing to Solomon a power he didn't really have, and only really later people had that kind of power. Right? So that's kind of the argument. And so it's a matter for chronology and stratigraphy and all these kinds of things, because we have big stuff that was built, and the question is when. Was it during the 10th century or was it later? If it's during the 10th century, it demonstrates that a David/Solomon had that kind of authority. If it's later, it demonstrates they probably didn't, or at least we haven't yet found anything that shows they had that kind of authority. So what do we see? Well, along comes a group primarily focused in Denmark that together as a school are called the Biblical Minimalists. And Davies and Thompson and some other guys are names associated with this. And they were all the rage here about 10 years ago. They argue that the biblical texts that talk about the 10th century, David, Solomon, etc., that is, the books of Kings and Chronicles, were in fact written really late. 200 BC, 100 BC, way later, hundreds and hundreds of years after the events. And what they're doing is basically making up fictional founding stories. What they are doing is developing a mythology for Israel. There wasn't a real David, there wasn't a real Solomon. They did not have that kind of power. Israel was sort of a ragtag tribal society at the time. And but later, these very, very much later sources made a bunch of stuff up and attributed it backwards to these guys to make Israel sound like it was greater, earlier, and more important, and that gives them some stature. That's the biblical minimalists. In other words, those biblical texts contain minimal history. Instead, it's mainly mythology. And even the names of David and Solomon, maybe they didn't even exist. These biblical minimalists have been roundly thrashed by archaeologists and historians because most of their assumptions don't work very well. They're making much later dates for the book, or much later dates for the books than the evidence seems to support. And the things they say about archaeology, archaeologists largely say, no, that doesn't work. So for the most part, these guys have been soundly thrashed and kind of pushed into a corner. But coming out of this whole debate, one elite Israeli archaeologist, arguably one of the greatest living archaeologists, by the name of Israel Finkelstein from the Hebrew University, said, wait a minute, those biblical minimalists, they're wrong about a lot of things, but what they exposed was, in fact, most of that monumental architecture that Albright and others attributed to David and Solomon, it's not from their time. It's from a later time. And everybody, when Israel Finkelstein speaks, people sit up and listen. What? How is that possible? We always thought these were 10th century. How can you say that? Hence, the great debate begins. So, Finkelstein is proposing a revised chronology for the archaeology that kind of dates a lot of these things later than people once thought, and he's doing so on really solid archaeological grounds. So what do we do with that? Well, it raises all kinds of interesting questions, and I just named a few of them. In what sense are the biblical accounts historical? How can we know the dates of certain structures? What pottery represents the 10th century? How are the remains of various tells related to each other? What is the archaeological record of the 10th century? And what does this evidence reveal about the historical David and Solomon? So historians and archaeologists and biblical scholars have gone to work on this stuff in the last decade. I went to a whole conference devoted to this question. Finkelstein was there, and all the top archaeologists in the world were there hacking away at each other. It was rather quite fun. Okay, now I need to introduce you a little bit to archaeology speak, so you get a sense of how archaeologists talk about these things. Archaeologists, remember, talk about ages in relation to the metals, primarily, or the main materials that people made stuff out of. So we talked about the Bronze Age, and really when we're talking about Israelite history, the Israelites enter the land somewhere right around the end of the Bronze Age, and then in the early Iron Age. David is 1,000, so basically up to about David is Iron 1, so we're in the Iron Age, and then right after David we're into Iron 2A, and then we have a couple of other periods after that. So our main interest is this transition from Iron 1 to Iron 2A, right? Between 1,000 and 900, right? That's the 10th century. Okay, so that's so that would be the United Kingdom. So the United Kingdom fits right here, and then the divided kingdom right there. Okay. Now, very interesting piece of evidence. This is a colleague of mine, archaeologist in Israel, did this work again about 12 years ago. He did a survey. So there's archaeological excavations, which we talked about. There's also survey archaeology. Survey archaeology is you trained archaeologists walk around places in careful grid patterns and take measurements, etc., and they describe the things they find on the surface. And they look in particular for things that are on the surface. So they're not excavating, but things that are on the surface that indicate the date of certain things. And this was a fascinating study he did. He walked all over the area that we call Samaria now, or the West Bank, the area of Nablus, the hill country north of Jerusalem, between Jerusalem and the Sea of Galilee, this hill country. Now please understand that if you know anything about Israel, there's two good places to live. There's the good land and the bad land. The good land is on the coast. And the other good land is right along the river, because of course you got water. The bad land is in between, right? So this is the cheap, low rent district, the hill country. Nobody wants to live there because they have neither water nor ocean or anything. They're kind of landlocked. It's not a great place to live. In other words, it is the last place people are going to want to live. So, what they found when they did this major survey of the area was that about 1300 BC, in this whole area, there were only 12 little villages. In 1200 BC, there's 116. What happened? Something big happened in the low rent district between 1300 and 1200 BC. What happened? Well, remember, that's one of the dates for the Exodus for the Hebrews. If you are having large numbers of people coming into a land all at one time, wouldn't you expect to see it on the ground? Yeah. And he says, yeah, here it is. And where are they going to move? They're going to move to the places that aren't already taken. Right? So they're not going to be able to go into the coast, and they're not going to go into the river area that much. They're going to go mainly up in the hill country because that's where they can go. That's a path of least resistance. They can fight outward from there, and so we see all these settlements happening between 1300 and 1200. I told you this is one of those pieces of evidence and to me it's really quite strong evidence, A, that there was an Exodus, and B, that the later date makes more sense. Now, other people argue other ways, and this doesn't solve all the problems. There's lots of other problems, but this at least is a new piece of evidence to enter into that conversation, and it's very important. For our purposes, also pay attention to the map because there's key sites here. Chatzor. Can you say that? You have to say Chatzor. Chatzor. All right. Say that really close to somebody. Chatzor. And then Megiddo. And of course, here's Jerusalem. So these are important sites for our purposes. Now, a very important piece of evidence, you've already met this guy, Pharaoh Shoshank. The Hebrews called him Shishak. And remember what's important about him? What's important about him? Shishak attack. Right? Remember the Shishak attack? Is that Japanese? Shishak attack. Sounds sort of Japanese, doesn't it? I don't know. So, interesting piece of evidence here. Two pieces of evidence. This is a temple in the Egyptian city of Karnak, set up by Pharaoh Shishak. This is him. This is his self-portrait. Okay, so there's a pharaoh, and he's got lots of hieroglyphics around it, telling all kinds of stories from his reign, and those stories tell about all the cities that he conquered, including Arad, Gibeon, Megiddo, etc. So he's talking about the Shishak attack. He is. 2 Chronicles also talks about the Shishak attack. So these corroborate each other, right? Shishak is saying, I attacked. The Hebrews are saying, he attacked. And it's right around 925, 926 that the Shishak attack happened. And at Megiddo, one of the places that he attacked, he actually set up a trophy, kind of a stone inscription that says, Shishak was here and I, kicked Israeli butt. And that's what that says right there. That's Egyptian hieroglyphic for Israeli butt, right there. This is actually it. This was found at Megiddo. So you have this Egyptian victory stela set up in honor that Shishak himself set up when he was there. Okay, so really nice evidence. This is good evidence that we have a Shishak attack in Israel about 925. So if you can find it if you can find the destruction layer as you can at Megiddo, the burn layer where Shishak attacked, then you can date anything below that and anything above that, can't you? At least close to it. Okay, so big picture, and with this then we'll take a break. So big picture, what do we see on the ground that can help us kind of get signpost dates to make sense out of the 10th century? First of all, the early period, what I just showed you. Many new villages up in the hill country about 1200. Second, there used to be a whole bunch of evidence of like Egyptian pottery and Egyptian stuff around 1300 BC. By about 1200 BC, that's going away. You see less and less Egyptian stuff going on. Thirdly, we already talked about these. You see the rise of the Philistines on the coast. Remember them? So we see the Philistine sites on the coast. So those three things are all happening in this early period. Once that's stabilized, then we move to the United Monarchy, David and Solomon time. We have the Shishak attack. Then a couple hundred years later, we have the TP3 attack. Remember? Okay, so two big attacks that we're going to have associated burn layers that can help us date things. So it kind of puts bookends, and if you had one place that was attacked by both, then everything in between is taking place in those 200 years. Then, of course, we have the later attack, which destroy the northern kingdom, the siege of Samaria. We have Sennacherib's siege of Jerusalem and Lachish we talked about, and we have the Babylonian exile. So all those things, depending on where you are, you ought to be able to see on the ground at certain sites, and if you can figure that out, then that can help you sort out the chronology. Okay? So now we have all the pieces in place. Now what we're going to do is travel to various archaeological sites that in fact show some of these signs to see what sense we can make out of the 10th century. And in particular, what we want to see, we got to test this. These are city gates. City gates, so think of it. If you're going to build a wall around your city, walls are nice, right? They protect you. But what's the problem with a wall? You're kind of stuck. If you just wall yourself in, you're kind of stuck, right? You're going to starve to death in there. So what do you have to have? A gate. So the thing is, your gate's your weak point, isn't it? That's where you can most easily be attacked. So how do you protect yourself from an attack at the gate? That's the great question. So, pretty simple rules. You can understand it pretty quickly. Let's look at the Hatzor gate. So this is outside and this is inside. And what you can see here is, this is the real thing. So here's the middle here. See this wall? This is a wall. There's a city wall, and the city wall goes to the other side. And this is how you enter. You come in Main Street. This is Main Street. Okay, that's outside, this is inside. Can you see it? Yeah. Okay. So, and what you do is you put big wooden doors right here. Either side of those wooden doors and sticking out in front of them, towers. Why towers? First rule of history. Easier to throw things down, right? Go up in the tower and throw, I don't know, hot oil, old food, large children, cattle, whatever, throw them down on the people who are attacking. So you, and then, and you make it a real bummer for anybody pulling up a battering ram is trying to knock down your door. You got all this stuff flying down on them, and you're giving them a bad day. Another thing you want to do is have a narrow street. These streets are some of the widest, actually, for city gates, but they're only about 3 meters wide. In other words, only 2 by 2 can people come in. You can't let, in a big crowd, a big army is funneled down, and they have to come in 2 by 2. When they come in, you put inside, as they come in, you have these little rooms, 6 of them. These are called gate chambers. 6 gate chambers, and what do? You pack soldiers in the gate chambers. You can pack about 10 soldiers in a gate chamber. So as 2 people come through this door, after having everything thrown on them from the towers, then what happens? They get to fight a battle. 2 on 20. And then if they make it past them, they get to do it again. 2 on 20. And then if they make it past them, they get to do it again. And they will only be able to get inside your city if they can win all of those. Okay? Pretty smart, huh? Now notice the architecture of these 3 gates. This is Megiddo, Gezer, and Hatzor. And right away, what do you see? They are virtually the same. In fact, exactly the same measurement of the main street. 6 chambers, 2 towers, door in the middle. They all follow exactly the same pattern. How come, and by the way, they're unlike anything else. How come they follow exactly the same pattern? There must have been a master architect. These are big, huge. Okay? They cover a better part of an acre. So these big, huge gates, how long is it going to take to build this? How much is it going to cost? This is a huge project, and it's not just 1, it's 3. At 3 key strategic cities around Israel to protect Israel. This is evidence of monumental architecture. This is monumental architecture. It takes huge resources. It takes coordination. It takes one single architect to apply it slightly differently with the different topography of the hills, but nevertheless, the same basic pattern. It takes a huge amount of labor, a huge amount of resources. Somebody's got to be in charge of all that. Who was that somebody? The Bible says it was Solomon. The question is it right? Do these gates date from the right period? If they do, we have really nice corroboration. If they don't, we have a problem. That is the problem of the 10th century, and after break, we'll figure it out. All right? All right, let's take 15 minutes.
to do with his like pottery or something.
Am I on? All right, I'm on. So back to the problem of the 10th century. How are we going to solve this? Well, for one thing, I told you that what the Bible says, so let's look carefully at the text. You, of course, have read it already. 1 Kings chapter 9. So there's this very brief reference to the other building projects of Solomon. Now, of course, there's a temple. That's a big one too. But other building projects of Solomon. And this is very interesting. Solomon built the Lord's temple, his own palace, the Millo, whatever the heck that is. Linguists have trouble figuring out how to translate that word. The wall of Jerusalem, and 3 cities, Hatzor, Megiddo, and Gezer. As well as all his store cities and the towns for his chariots and for his horses. The grammar seems to suggest that Hatzor, Megiddo, and Gezer were store cities or towns for chariots and horses, though it's a little bit unclear. But notice the names of those 3 towns, the only 3 that are mentioned. 3 towns that are otherwise are not very well known. Hatzor, Megiddo, and Gezer. Why those 3? And then, of course, you go right back here, and guess what? That is precisely those 3 cities that have those 3 city gates. So if he is building those 3 cities, then there seems a fairly obvious connection that as part of building those 3 cities, he had the resources, he had the control, and when he built up those cities, he was the one who had the common architect. He was the one who pulled together the resources to build these big gates, to protect these places. Now, if you look on a map where these places are, they are the 3 key sites for the protection of Israel. Hatzor is the gates of the north. Gezer is the gates of the Shephelah, the foothills. So if you're going to attack Israel from the west, you've got to go through Gezer. And Megiddo controls an important pass moving from the inland out to the coast, which is the primary roadway of antiquity called the Via Maris. Now, a key, as you might expect, is going to be pottery. Because remember, we're asking about the date of these gates. So how do you date a gate? You might ask. You might have dated people you thought might as well be a gate, but this isn't the one. Oh, that's terrible. How do you date a gate? So think about it. If you're going to build a stone wall, what you'd probably do if you're at all a good builder is you dig a trench first. Wouldn't you? You dig a trench, you make, right, and then you take your first layers of stones and you put them in the trench, and you start building up from there, and then when you get it good and stabilized, you take the dirt that you dug out of the trench and you fill it in the sides and stabilize the bottom courses of the wall, right? Anybody build a wall? This is how you do it. Okay. So what we have is what we call a foundation trench. A foundation trench. And when you get done, you backfill the foundation trench to stabilize it. When you backfill, you're just taking all the stuff that's there and stuffing it into the gaps on the sides. And therefore, when you do excavation, what you do is you excavate into the foundation trench, and the youngest pottery you find in the foundation trench dates the wall. Does that make sense? Older stuff, of course, can naturally get in there, but the youngest stuff would only get stuck in there at the time of construction, so that dates the wall. Do you understand? Yes. Okay. So, this is what we're looking at. What pottery do you find in the foundation trenches of these gates that will date the gate? But therein lies the problem. And the key here, at least one of the keys, is this. So we have 2 kinds of, okay, how can I explain this? Okay, remember they don't have glaze. The Hebrews didn't have glaze. That's a Muslim thing. So if you want to make your pot look kind of nice and shiny, how do you do it if you don't have glaze? Well, one of the things you can do is different sorts of wash. You can take, say, a little bit of clay and mix it in some water and kind of make a slushy thing, and you can kind of rub that over the outside of the clay and then fire it. And it'll give you a little bit different color, and it might be a little finer, it might give a little more shine to it. But when you get done, what you want to do is take a smooth rock and rub on that surface. And when you take a smooth rock and rub on that surface of the clay, it makes it shiny. We call that burnishing. Okay, burnished pottery. So, a natural thing to do is to take your pot, take your rock, and hand burnish it. You can tell hand burnishing very simply. You can see on the left, because the burnishing, the lines of the burnishing, they're not straight. They kind of cross over because it's done by hand. Or what you can do is you can, it's hard, if you've ever done pottery, this is not very easy, but you take some wet clay and you stick it on the wheel and you stick this into the wet clay and get it centered, start it spinning, and run your rock along the side. That's wheel burnished pottery. So the bottom one is wheel burnished, the top one is hand burnished. And the question is, when was wheel burnished and when was hand burnished? The theory is probable that early on they did hand burnishing, and then somebody said, ooh, we can do wheel burnishing, and that was easier and faster once you got it going, once you figured out how to do it. So then they switched from one to the other and they went to wheel burnish. So wheel burnish is probably a little bit later. Hand burnish is a little bit earlier. And they're both being made right about our key time when these gates are being made. So now what do we see? Oh, there's a little more hand burnishing for you. Let's go to Tel Megiddo, shall we? Yes. And at Tel Megiddo, you can see here on the map, here's Megiddo. Now, when you went, major trade route from the ancient world, you would go, Damascus is up here, you'd go across the north, you come into the north, you go down by Hatzor, so Hatzor is the key to protecting you from the north. If you got by Hatzor, you'd come down to the west side of the Sea of Galilee, and then you'd swing out here, there's a mountain pass, that's where Megiddo is, so it protects the mountain pass. Then once you get to the mountain pass, you hit what they call the Way of the Sea, the ocean road, and you go up the ocean road. And if you wanted to attack Jerusalem, you'd come down here, and then you'd come up from the coast, just like you do from the airport now at Tel Aviv. You'd come up from the coast and attack Jerusalem. Gezer is right there. So these are the three keys. Hatzor, Megiddo, and Gezer are the three keys to protecting Jerusalem. That's why you would choose to build those three cities and to put strong fortified gates at them. Now here's the rub. Yeah, I know. Israel Finkelstein, before he worked on Megiddo, he worked on Jezreel. Jezreel's right next to Megiddo. So Jezreel was this palace that was built by Ahab and Jezebel, where they had that horrible story of them getting killed and Jezebel getting, eaten by dogs, and that whole awful story. Okay, that is Jezreel. It's right next to Megiddo. So they excavated at Megiddo, or at Jezreel, and on the left are the kinds of pots they found at Jezreel. On the right are the kinds of pots they found in the foundation trench of the gate at Megiddo. And when you look at them side by side, they're very similar, aren't they? They're very similar. So what does this tell you? Jezreel was not built until 850, 100 years after Solomon. If the same kind of pottery that is at Jezreel was in the foundation trench of the gate at Megiddo, therefore the Megiddo gate was built when? About the same time as Jezreel, and the result of that is it wasn't during Solomon's time, it was 100 years later, maybe 80 years later. That is the key to Israel Finkelstein's argument. And you can see, it's pretty persuasive. Even that one picture, you can understand why people have to take him seriously. But that's not all the evidence. So, now I should tell you, Megiddo has been excavated and excavated and excavated and picked over, and the city gate is not very well preserved. And so the result is that the evidence at Megiddo, while it's important, isn't great. The evidence is much better at Gezer and Hatzor, just more abundant because it hasn't been picked over as much. Plus, everything's better preserved. So the result is that what we can learn from Hatzor and Gezer can shed light back on what was going on in Megiddo. So now let's go to Hatzor. Can you say Hatzor? Hatzor. Okay, here you see the site. Here you see where the site is, way up in the north, above the Sea of Galilee. And now, this is the archaeologist's drawing of the main features of the site. This is where you have that double wall, what we call a casemate wall. Double wall. Double walls are kind of cool because in time of peace, you can leave them open and have like rooms, shops, storage, guards can be stationed there, whatever. During time of war, you can fill it with junk, and it makes for a flexible wall, right? Anybody hits it with a battering ram, and the wall kind of flexes. So it's kind of a nice move to have a double wall. Here's the gate. So you get the double wall, here's the gate complex, and you can see the double wall, little pieces of it remain around the outside. Here's what you see inside. This is the excavation of the palace. So this is the area marked that's covered now. This is when the excavation was first going on, just as you come in the gate on the left. Look down in these holes. See what you see in there? What do you see? Black. See the black? What is that? Burn. This is ash. This is the Canaanite palace that predated the time of the Hebrews. According to the book of Joshua and his troops, King Yabin of Hatzor made a coalition with 5 other cities to take out Joshua. Joshua attacked, defeated them, and when he defeated them, it says, very specifically in Joshua, that he burned Hatzor to the ground, but not the other cities. Hatzor alone, he burned to the ground. There's the burn layer. You have a really nice burn layer. That burn layer dates to 1250. This is the other big piece of evidence that's recently been discovered that points more toward the later date of the Exodus. So this fits with those. This is the same time as those villages being founded up in the hill country. So those are the 2 new pieces of evidence that are part of the conversation now in terms of the date of the Exodus. There is no way to date this burn layer earlier. There is, though, the possibility of an earlier burn layer, which I don't know that it exists, but there's some argument about that. So anyhow, more to come, I'm sure, as these things get debated their way through. What's important for our purposes, though, is not that, but the gate. After the Hebrews have taken the place, this big gate system. So there you see a lovely picture of the gate. Here you can see the double wall going off. I had to jump really high to take this picture, so appreciate it. All right, there's the 2 towers. Here's where you would have the wooden doors. There's Main Street going in and the 6 gate chambers. Now, what's really nice about Hatzor is all of this building here is one unit. That is, when you look carefully at it, the stones are laid in overlap patterns. So they were all built at the same time, in other words. If you finish a wall and then start another wall, you're going to have what's called a straight seam. But if they're interlaced like that, it means it's a continuous construction. So, what you can see here is the gate down here. There's the double wall. There's a building over there, and all of that is one set of construction. This stuff is built on top of that earlier construction. So this is a later remodel. That's also important because this is probably 9th century. So the green stuff is what the archaeologist Amnon Ben Tor, archaeologist of Hatzor, he says this is all 10th century. So he's arguing against Finkelstein. He's saying Finkelstein is wrong because when I look at all this gate stuff, I can check foundation trench in all those areas, and all of it dates to the 10th century, and it has to date to the 10th century. It can't be later. Why does he say that, you might ask? Did I hear you ask that? Oh, good, I'm glad you asked. So there's the picture. Okay. Here's some of the pottery that was found in the foundation trench. Now here's the reasoning. This is a little technical, but stay with me. According to the archaeologists there, the traditional chronology, the gate was built during the time of Solomon. That is about 950 BC. The gate, everybody agrees, was destroyed by TP3. Remember him? TP3 came in and burned the place down. Everybody agrees with that. So our ending date, the gate is destroyed 732. The only question is, when was it built? The thing is, though, after the gate was built, there are 6 strata on top of that before the burn layer from TP3. 6 layers, 6 strata. And some of those strata are subdivided in what they call subphases, mini strata. There are 6 strata and 11 or 12 subphases. That means that, look what we have, 220 years. So the gate was only there for 220 years on this chronology. And during that period of time, you had 6 strata. That's only 35 years per stratum. That is really, really short period of time for one stratum to be laid down. And for 6 in a row, 35 years on average. That's really, really short period of time. And even the subphases then have to go down to 15 per phase. The average in Israel is about 70 years per stratum, so about twice that. So this is a really short period of time. You kind of feel like, gosh, it's almost too little time to allow for that much change. But look what happens if Finkelstein is right. If Finkelstein is right, this gate is not built in 950, it's built in 880. But it's destroyed at the same time, still 732. So that only gives you 150 years for all that stuff to happen. So now you're down to 25 years per stratum, and that is simply unparalleled. It doesn't happen. Basically, Amnon Ben-Tor says Finkelstein's chronology is simply impossible at Hatzor. There's not room to account for all the stratification. Pretty good argument. Not a clincher, but a good argument. How about Gezer? Gezer is the 3rd city. What does it have to show us? Here you see the city gate. Again, you can see the 6 chambers. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Towers out front. This gap you see in the main street, that's the sewer. They actually had a sewer system running out. It would have been covered over, of course, for the street. Now here's Gezer. So here's Jerusalem, and Gezer is in the foothills. So you come up from the coastal road, basically the same road you'd take from Tel Aviv now to come to Jerusalem, and you'd have to go through Gezer. Gezer, by the way, is a very poorly preserved archaeological site. It's, in fact, I took a couple of students there. Only time I've been up in Gezer, I took a couple of students with me, and I looked on a map, and they said, Gezer is over here. So we went driving around trying to find Gezer. And finally we stopped, and there's a kibbutz Gezer. And so I asked the people, hey, how do I get to the Tel Gezer? And they said, you go up, turning, broken car turning. And I found it. That's Israeli directions. You never ask Israeli directions. So after going up, turning, broken car turning, there actually was a broken car at one place between dirt roads. And what they found, the archaeologist here, Bill Deaver, American archaeologist, what he found at this excavation was at the gate level, when the gate was built, you had red slipped, hand burnished pottery. Then there was a destruction. On top of the gate, the Shishak attack, 925. And then it was fixed up again after the Shishak attack. But then in the foundation trench is wheel burnished pottery. So the hand burnished is earlier, he argues, then Shishak attack, then the rebuilding with the hand burnished, or the wheel burnished pottery. And so he says you can tell the chronology that way. And the Shishak attack is 925, so the gate has to be built before 925. That's Solomon time. Pretty good argument. And the thing is, it fits really well with what the guy at Hatzor said also. How about Tel Rahov? This is a fairly new excavation going on, about 8 years old. Tel Rahov. Tel Rahov is so new I had to put it on the map myself. So there it is, just south of Bet Shan on the Jordan River. Here's an interesting kind of Canaanite altar area. Here it apparently was in honor of Asherah. You heard of Asherah poles, so here's Asherah, the fertility goddess, Canaanite fertility goddess. Here's some of the buildings they found there. Very strange looking buildings, very strange architecture, and one of the really interesting things they did, you can see buried under the ground are wooden beams in the foundations of these walls. I don't know if you know anything about earthquakes, but I grew up in Southern California. We experienced lots of earthquakes. The Dead Sea Rift, the valley where the Jordan River is, that is the single most earthquake prone region in the world. Because it's the meeting of major plates, the African and the Asian plate. touch there. So it's why it's also the lowest, by the Dead Sea being the lowest place on Earth, about 1,200 feet below sea level, because those two tectonic plates hit and they go, and so you get way below sea level. So because those plates are rubbing against each other, you get earthquakes. Such an earthquake-prone area, one of the things you learn if you have to deal with earthquakes is you don't want a rigid foundation, you want a flexible foundation. And so modern skyscrapers, they actually have rubber in the foundation, so when the ground shakes, the building doesn't have to shake completely with the ground, and it's got a shock absorber. They use wood for it. Isn't that fascinating? Just a weird little development there. Okay, so what does Tel Rehov tell us? Well, what they found there was they found red slipped hand-burnished pottery found in 2 different strata spanning multiple subphases, and in between they had the Shishak attack. So what does this tell us? What they're saying in Tel Rehov is, you know what? We had both hand-burnished and wheel-burnished pottery on top of the Shishak attack. What does that mean? It means the hand-burnished version lasted a long time. It crossed that bridge.